Yes, somebody. Thank you. Yeah. You have to speak up, I think, because there's a bit of a din outside.
Firstly, I wanted to ask, you talked about what happened in 1968 as a result of the war, and I was wondering if you could get a little bit more into how the security forces responded, how the regime responded to what happened. And I also have another question about calling Nasser a military dictator. And I'm not arguing he's not a dictator, but I think that when we use these terms to describe the Nasser regime, perhaps it's masking some of the nuances or the conflict that's actually going on within the state that's leading to this tightening of security over trade unions between the military and the regime at the time.
Anybody else? Yeah, okay, can I add one in there?
Sure.
That's okay. You were talking about, I think that's in the 1960s, a vibrant workers' movement. I was wondering what the content of it was. You said they were starting from scratch. I think you meant that from an organisational point of view, and that in itself, of course, is a content, I suppose. But what were they organising around? And I'm not going to now have a third question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, what you thought about. Obviously, there was kind of an outsourcing of power, like with the strike becoming replaced by the sort of corporatist form of unionism. Or, I mean, you said unions were abandoned in totality. It was almost like it was just totally outsourced to the state. So, would you say that perhaps this was a trend that emerged globally throughout that period, with, like, for instance, in America, where we had like Saul Alinsky becoming like the kind of one of the biggest union leaders, not leaders, but he kind of it was his model of unionism that came to dominate, rather than the strike itself, which actually, like, as a tactic previously had actually was it also structured the way in which union activism took place. So it was a very direct form of unionism, whereas it became commonplace throughout the world, and that's why I bring up Saul Alinsky, to just sort of outsource that power of the strike towards negotiation and towards that kind of lobbying and political discussion, that kind of.
Okay, I think that's a reasonable start then.
Alright.
Deal with that?
Yeah. So let's start with repression. So unlike in previous episodes, after 1967, I mean, the security forces, of course, tried to repress the movements, but it was really with the glove instead of the fist that they approached these movements. So, for example, with the students' movement, a few of the student leaders were then put into jail, but there was no very hard, massive repression of the students themselves at that time. It was only at the end, I think, of 1968, when there was violence within the movement itself against, I think there was against the cinemas and things like that, that the security forces had found an excuse to intervene, which was then also supported by a broader layer of the population, this kind of repression. And I think if you look at 2011 and 2012, we see a bit of the same tendency that at the beginning protests after Tahrir were still widely supported, but then when these protests sometimes got violent, that the regime had an excuse to intervene, so-called to save society from chaos, etc. So we see, I mean, the same at the end of 1968, when the movement was a bit, perhaps temporarily on the decline, that the regime was able to come back and repress a few of the leaders and the movement. With regard to the Nasser regime, I completely agree, of course. I mean, in the literature, if you read, for example, Robert Springborg, he says, like, what was really going on was a constant clash between a presidential dictatorship and a military dictatorship. Because Nasser, he came from the military, but then quickly tried to obtain his independence from the military. And then we see his main competitor, Marshal Ammar, he was also seen as a potential new president for Egypt. So we see on the one hand this clash between the presidency and the military, and then others such as Kandil, they try to describe how the whole security apparatus was established by the president to have a different power base than the military. But as a whole, and this is, I think, an argument of Springborg with which I agree, is that Egypt can still be described as a military society because the elite within the society since the 1950s is really the military. And even when this power base of the military is challenged, for example, in the 1990s, especially in the 2000s, by neoliberal crony capitalist group around Gamal Mubarak, then still in the end it's the military that is able to, the coup that happened in 2011, it was not the Ministry of Interior that was able to stop the movement, it was the military. And it's because it's able to play this role that it's still the main force within Egyptian society. So yes, I agree that it's a very complicated picture with different forces trying to vie for power within the Egyptian state, but on the other hand, it's still mainly a military dictatorship. And if you look, at what happened with Sisi taking over power, it was because of his position within the military that he was able to take power. And again, he tries to follow the trajectory of Nasser by building up a power base of his own to get rid of this dependency of the military as well. So I don't know if that answers a bit your question, or if you disagree. Sorry? Okay. So anti-unionism as a global trend, or not perhaps anti-unionism, but different ways of unionizing. I think yes and no, in the sense that the increase of informal precarious labor necessitated different forms than traditional trade union organization. So, and this is a global trend, and also in Egypt since the 1970s we see an increase of non-industrial, informal, precarious labor. But still, it's very interesting that after 2011, a lot of, for example, street vendors try to organize themselves on union basis or independent in independent trade unions, because they saw what for example, the textile workers did, the teachers did, the pensioners did, with their own struggles and establishing new independent unions. And this happened partly before the uprising in 2011, but really accelerated after the uprising. So unionizing was seen as a means to obtain their rights, their social rights. So this was perhaps, I don't know, unique to Egypt, but really the specific situation of Egypt that really stimulated the formation of independent trade unions. Why? Also because, before 2011, you had the main state union, which did not function as a trade union at all. So it was a state bureaucracy, and so people revolted against this state bureaucracy and tried to set up something different, which they called a trade union. And this trade union always started from local struggles from below until independent trade unions were set up. And then you can see a new kind of bureaucratization taking place, because there were two main branches of independent trade union federations, so who tried to from like a national federation of independent trade unions. And one of those branches, they sought advice, for example, from Western Europe trade union organizations or from the ILO, and they really imported all the wrong bureaucratic ideas or methods within this very new and very experimental trade union environment of Egypt. So that was ironically something I think very, very negative that happened. So they were looking for assistance, and so they thought, okay, we're going to these established Western trade unions to look for advice and methods, etc. And you see that a lot of the bureaucratic deviations, if we can call it like that, were imported within their own struggle from the outside. So I don't know if that fully answers the question.
That was a really, really good point, but I think I wasn't very clear in what I said, because I was actually talking about unionism under Nasser, or the absence of unionism, which emerged after, at the same time as the strike was kind of dropped as a tactic. So I was trying to point to the way in which the strike was actually dropped as a tactic outside of Egypt as well during that period, and I was giving the example of the US and the new model of unionism there, which became prevalent, and it's the teachings of Saul Alinsky of the lobbying and negotiation. So it was that, but your point that you just made was really interesting.
Okay, but it's interesting because from let's say my Belgian perspective, dropping the strike in the 1960s is very weird, because the 1960s, for example, in Belgium and in many Western European countries, was like a period where there were lots of industrial strikes, because the workers' movement was quite strong still in this period. Of course, a lot of strikes had this kind of ritualistic element in them, but also 1968. I mean, we probably discussed it before in France. I mean, there was a general strike as well. I mean, the strike was not did not disappear.
1961.
And then
general strike. Very important.
Yes, indeed. But what was interesting in the Nasserist period is that you saw there was still resistance, of course. I mean, people had this work-in tactic, etc. But much more individualized, much more in the shape of everyday resistance, so sabotage. But it was not as much prevalent as in the previous period, because the machines and the factory, especially in big industrial workplaces, were seen as of the people. So you don't sabotage your own machines. And this was really a sentiment of a lot of workers, that the factory was theirs. So they went on negotiating with factory management, but always from the point of view that it was their factory, even though it wasn't. And this was a big realization in the 1970s, when the cuts began, when austerity began, what are they doing to our factory? So there, for example, there was a lack of investment, so machines got older, and this was brought forward not by the management, they couldn't care, but by the workers themselves. They said, we aren't competitive anymore because the machinery is outdated, so you should invest in this factory. So they really saw this factory as their own, and that's why for a long period there was this distorted subjectivity, towards capital, because they did not see their relation as a relation of labor to capital, but as people versus the state, especially in the nationalized industry, of course.
I did ask about the context of some of the strikes, but you've answered some of that in talking about workers considering themselves as part of the factory in some way, that it's their factory, and so they were against the state. But was it their state as well? Or that somehow it's going off track and they wanted to get it back on track or something? How are they thinking about that?
Well, I've talked with a few workers who worked at that time in the factory, and it's only with like the communist workers that you see that there is this critical attitude toward the Nasser regime. When you talk with non-politicized workers, there is still this image of the state and of Nasserism as something that was for them, you know. And if they wanted something, they could negotiate with factory management. So there is this, like nationalist identity among workers, which is much more stronger than like a class identity up until the 1970s, and then they have the feeling like, oh, when Sadat came, then everything changed.
Does that include things like provision of public housing, improvement of education?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, for
example, basis for something.
Yeah, if you look at the factory in Mahala, for example, it's people live inside the factory. It's a factory of when originally 28,000 workers. So it's a huge factory, and it's a world within the community. So they live in the factory, they marry in the factory, they go to a cafe in the factory. Their whole lives are spent within the factory wall, so it's their world. I mean, you know.
It's like Lanarkshire.
It's
like Lanarkshire.
In Scotland.
In Scotland. I forgot who started it.
Robert Owen.
Who started Lanarkshire?
Robert Owen.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, I think you had a question.
Yeah.
And anybody else? Well, you go first. Okay. So, and then you, please, got your name, and at the back.
So, I think two things, probably continuing from the answers you've given to other questions. One, so you talked about the street vendors and so on, and the movement of, which I think in a lot of countries in the global south, you know, there's a huge section of the working class that is not in a steelworks or a textile works or whatever, that is in this what we now call precarious workers. And you mentioned that movement about the 2000s, but do you have any evidence that there were such movements, community movements and so on, in the Nasserist period? And connected to that, I mean, what about Palestinian refugees? Is there any sign of any connection between them and the workers' movement? What are they? How are they reacting to all these things that you've described? And a second question, which I think you partly relevant to what you said in answer to William. So you said you mentioned communist workers, but you know, what does communism mean? So in the Soviet Union in this period, you have socialist dissidents who actually, you know, they say, well, the Soviet Union is not anywhere near to achieving socialism. Our idea of socialism is this, and I'm not talking about the sort of big intellectuals who had connections with the West who lived in Moscow, but they might be out somewhere in a small factory town somewhere, and they're writing little manifestos about what their political idea is for the aspirations of the working class. So what do we know about the political aspirations of the working class? And when you say communist, I mean, did that mean pro-Soviet, or did that mean what sort of content? What did that mean, that word?
Yeah, I was just, when you said something about people against the state, it made me think that in some partial way it sounds more similar to what was going on in the 60s with mass black uprisings against the state, basically, mostly proletariat, you know, against repression and against, you know, assassinations and against the discontinuing of civil rights, the state trying to really stop it, etc. And also I was curious about, you said that the workers asked for assistance from Western unions. I wonder if you could enumerate or, you know, name some of those that they asked for assistance from.
Another question?
I was going to meet Egypt back in, I think, 1985, and the thing that struck me there was both the poverty in Cairo, extreme poverty, and extreme wealth in some parts of Cairo, which, I mean, was quite of an extreme sort. The division between rich and poor seems somehow worse than in India or China, other places I've been. at the time. And the other thing, of course, which I found sort of amusing and disturbing, was this way in which the Mubarak, or the leaders of the government, identified with the pharaohs. I mean, they very much see themselves in the continuing tradition, and that's both absurd and also not, in the sense you get the feeling, I got the feeling, maybe completely, that there's something about Egyptian civilization going back thousands and thousands of years, and that's it somehow in the culture. And of course, I'm just thinking, well, what is going to crack that? And clearly capitalism, has begun to crack that thousands and thousands of years repressive civilization and authoritarianism. But it surely, if there's one similarity, despite all the huge differences between Egypt in the 20th century and Egypt, in previous millennia, it's sort of a patriarchy, it's a domination. What is the big hope in 2011 was when women were demonstrating and taking actions, and things seemed to be changing there, and then it all seems to have disappeared. But then you keep hearing about this new feminist movement there. What parts of that movement are working class, and how does that relate? I mean, is Egyptian society at a social level coming under, really beginning to transform, or has the repression crushed it and contained it so it doesn't transform?
Yeah. All right. Historical evidence of informal workers protesting in the 1960s. It's not my main field of expertise, so I'm going to be cautious, but I think there is little evidence because historians haven't looked for it. Because the main interest until 20 years ago was for the big movements of industrial workers, textile workers, steel workers, I think in Europe as well. So there is very little evidence, also because these kind of movements, they often leave very little evidence unless in oral sources, if you can talk, of course, to people. So honestly, I wouldn't know. Yeah, what's the evidence? So yeah, it's perhaps a research project more than an answer.
Okay.
Yeah, the same with Palestinian refugees. Of course, Nasser, had really the image of that he would solve the Palestinian question and so on. But about relation between Palestinian refugees and the workers' movement specifically, I don't know any concrete answers. Perhaps someone else in the room might. Communist workers, I know something more about that. So of course there were different communist workers. In the whole of the world. It was a period of big schisma, and so you had Soviet communists and Chinese communists who were inspired by cultural revolution, of course, in China. But especially the Soviet communists, who were in a majority, they had the problem of the relation of the Soviet Union with Nasser, because this relation changed from being very cordial to a bit more distant to cordial again. So communists, they first supported the Nasserist regime because the relation with Soviet Union was good and Soviet Union supported Nasser. Then Nasser was thinking that communists were becoming more and more of a threat to the regime, so he began to repress them in a very vicious way. A whole generation of communists were jailed under Nasser up until 1965, when Nasser made a left shift because, all petty politics, of course, because at that time he saw what was happening, for example, in Syria, that there was a coup against the leadership in Syria, and he sought an alliance with the communists against possible coup from within the army. So he sought cadres who could man his party. So he had, before 1965, he had a party which was more like a loose movement, but he really wanted to establish a party in order to control society, but who would be able to do this? The communists, because they were clever and they knew how to organize. So when he established the Arab Socialist Union, he invited the communists to take up positions within the Arab Socialist Union, and the communists thought, this is our moment, to do something. We're out of jail. So he had this very strange and very ambiguous relation between communists and the Nasser regime. Also very ideologically, because the attitude, of course, of the Soviet Union toward the global South was, okay, you can have an independent road to socialism. I mean, you don't have to go through these stages as we've done. You don't have to have your socialist revolution. You can get there with your own nationalist type of regime. And Nasser, of course, he appeared to have established this kind of nationalist regime. I mean, by 1965, 90% of the industry the whole economy was nationalized, except for construction, except for trade. All heavy industry was nationalized. So, I mean, he was like on the right way to establish communism. So, for the workers, it was difficult because, on the one hand, I mean, they were repressed at some times, and it was an authoritarian regime, and they had to organize workers. And on the other hand, I mean, the regime was within the bigger geopolitical picture. It was an ally of the Soviet Union, and it seemed to have social policies. And they couldn't understand at this point the nature of these types of regimes. And I think a lot of leftists in this period struggled to understand, I mean, what was happening in China and the Cultural Revolution. Was China the real socialist country instead of the Soviet Union or not? So, I mean, so the political aspirations of communist workers were to support the regime, but to have a bigger role within the regime as communists. So, in order to steer it more towards the socialist path instead of the nationalist path. With regard to people against the state and the comparison, like the movement in the US, when I meant people against the state, it was not really in a confrontational sense. It was more like the binary was not labor capital, but people state. But the workers did not see this relation as a confrontational one. They saw it as something that had to be negotiated, and the state perhaps did not understand their aspirations or their goals, so they had to ask the state.
Why did they?
Because it was in their mind their state. I mean, they had their revolution in 1952. It was a nationalist regime of the producing classes, or whatever Nasser called this alliance between bourgeoisie and the working class. So according to them, it was their state. So and the state owned the factory, but it was they that owned through the state the factory. So I mean, it was, yeah. So it was not per se a confrontational relation. Of course, sometimes when factory management said, okay, no, we're not going to do this, then you had still forms of confrontation. But in their minds, it was not at the outset a relation of confrontation. Yeah. The idea of the pharaoh in Egypt, it's an interesting question, because it returns under Mubarak and Sadat. He tried to, so the president before Mubarak, I mean, after Arab nationalism, both presidents tried to find new ways of legitimizing the regime, not only politically but also culturally. Like Sadat, he tried to build the image of the president as a good Muslim, and tried to mobilize Islam for the interests of the regime. So, for example, you have under Sadat, in the constitution, suddenly there's a new constitution, and the Sharia is the basis of law in Egypt. So it was a big concession toward the Islamists on the one hand, but it was also trying to have a different kind of cultural legitimacy for the regime away from secular Arab nationalism. Of course, when Sadat was killed by Islamists, Mubarak said, let's not go there again. So he tried to find different ways of legitimizing the regime. And of course, Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, he tried to make this connection with ancient history. much like the Shah did in Iran, for example. I think there is a very interesting comparison between Iran and how the Shah tried to. But the same problem in Egypt as in Iran. Contemporary Egyptians, I mean, I found that there was very little interest among, let's say, ordinary Egyptians toward the pharaonic past. It was really alien and distant to them. I mean, they saw the pyramids, okay, it was interesting and it was good for tourism, but most of them, in my experience, of course, they lacked like a connection with this part of their history. Their history was more like Arab history. So they, I mean, the citadel in Cairo and the mosque, I mean, it was much closer to what they identified with as their culture than pharaonic Egypt. And it's like a Western fascination also. I mean, and of course in Britain you know everything about fascination with Egypt. So, but it's not really a fascination of the Egyptians, I found, of course. It's also a bit tricky, of course, to see similarities between pharaonic Egypt today. I mean, it screams Orientalism, and it's also a dangerous argument, because it's an argument in the more right-wing literature that, in fact, in Egypt you have always this kind of Praetorianism or whatever. So you have society, and on top of society there's this layer or military caste, and this is replaced, you know, and so you have like the Mamluks, and this is replaced by Muhammad Ali in the 19th century, and then you have in 1952 the free officers, and so I mean now you have Sisi, and you can't do anything because there is this kind of eternal military elite that stands on top of the society. And I mean, it's a dangerous argument because it ignores the whole history of social and political struggle in Egypt. I mean, you have in 1882 you have already a rebellion against the British. Then in 1919 you have a first Egyptian revolution against the monarchy, the landlords, and the British. So you have social struggles going in the 1920s, 1930s, and in the 1940s the big movement, and 1952 you get the big moment of struggle, 1968, 1977 when you have the bread riot. So there's a whole history of revolt, of trying to get rid of what's on top of society. And of course what's often not mentioned is how this layer on top of society is supported from without. I mean, by colonialism, by imperialism, up until today by Gulf capital. I mean, the biggest moneylender of Sisi is Saudi Arabia. They are a very important force in the region for all kind of counter-revolutionary forces, Sisi as well. So, yeah.
There was something said in this side of the group, and I'm just wondering if I misunderstood what exactly it was about women in Egypt only recently becoming maybe I misunderstood.
Yeah, I think it was I think it was an important movement in 2011, but there are different points I want to make. Firstly, when you were in Egypt in 2011, I mean, there was like a moral liberalization going on from below. I mean, youth who were very much under parental control, who were like leaving these restrictions of parental control, going much more out into the streets, sometimes women abandoning the headscarf, and so on. Not that I'm saying that it's per se a good thing or a bad thing to do so, but it was really a dynamic in the streets. At the same time, there was a growing consciousness, especially after the 8th of March 2011, when women were assaulted on Tahrir. So during the 18 days of the uprising, I mean, women were able to move freely in the streets and on Tahrir, and very few were harassed. But at the moment when this mobilization stopped, and when you have other elements coming into the streets back again, then you see that women are becoming harassed, and that it also becomes a specific tactic of the counter-revolution. I mean, officers organizing these virginity tests in the Egyptian museum, for example, for female activists, all these kind of horrendous things. So it becomes this kind of sexual politics. It becomes an instrument of the counter-revolution, and it's together with a growing. The role of violence also increases from 2012 onward, with the culmination in 2013 when there is like a mass hysteria against the Brotherhood, which ends in bloodbath, where 1,000 people die at a certain point, of the Muslim Brother activists, and this really smothers this revolutionary process in my view. Yeah.
I meant more in the sense that is this something recent that has just happened for I don't know what particular reason, or has this, like, have women played a part in struggle in Egypt in general, even during Nasser's time with independent?
Yeah, from below, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, if you look at, for example, in the 1970s, with the big struggles there, it were often women who were at the vanguard of these struggles, because they often had their dual role as workers, because in these new industries, women were also workers. So this was something new, and women also became bearers of this, national identity, identified with the national project, but also felt emboldened by this new position in society. But on the other hand, they also had to combine this with a still very traditional role in the family of being caretakers for family, for the children, and so on. So women played a very important role. But the problem in Egypt for a long time was that this role of women from below stood in contrast with the role of middle-class liberal women from above. For example, President Mubarak's wife, Susanna Mubarak, she was the figurehead of this kind of secular feminist movement from above in Egypt, which of course strengthened then more traditionalist, often Islamist criticisms of this kind of feminism, which was equated with a westernized way of living, and with all with imperialism and so on. So you had a very complex situation for feminism in Egypt, because the word feminism did not evoke the struggle of working women, which was, the struggle of women as workers, but not workers as women, because that was like the domain, especially of more liberal-minded feminists. And this only began to change, in my mind, from the 1990s onward, when you had feminist organizations like the New Women Foundation, who tried to organize women with a more from more social feminist point of view, or feminism from below. But this was still very, a very narrow base. It was an NGO, so you reach only very few women. And it was only with the protests in 2011, when women played an important role there, that this barrier between this kind of liberal feminism and the feminism that was happening on the ground without being called feminism was broken down, I think. But the result of this, I don't think it was able to be consolidated, because of the repression, and because of especially what happened in 2013 with this counter-revolution from below, which was a very, it was almost a fascist thing. I mean, using a mass movement and violence really to smother the revolutionary process, and not only defeating the Muslim Brotherhood, but also all the peacefulness that characterized the movement, the values of the movement. They were also destroyed within this kind of violent mobilization.
Any more Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was a big cult of personality around Nasser at the time, and if there was, how much were ordinary working class Egyptians enthralled or caught up in that cult of personality, and also how it exists today as a sort of looking back in with rose-tinted glasses sort of situation.
Can I add something to that? And what was the role of anti-imperialism in that image, possibly of Nasser and subsequent? Okay. Go.
Yeah. Yes, there was a big cult of Nasser. And again, I mean, it's always not good to have a cult of personality, of course, but it's also, I mean, in the image, it's almost logical that you have this figure that for a lot of Egyptians represented all their hopes and their desires, and also was like, I mean, this was someone who stood at the international scene. He was respected, he was recognized for what he was doing, who was seeming to lead the struggle of the non-aligned movement of a lot of people from the global south. So this was really like a progressive base for this cult of personality, which is at the same time the biggest problem, of course, because I mean, people identified with him. Workers, yes, of course. I mean, if you look in workers' homes at that period, but also after Nasser died, I mean, you see pictures of Nasser in their homes. And then if you look at sometimes in a shop, it's interesting that you can see how the shopkeeper is aligned. For example, if he has a picture of Nasser today, for example, a picture of Nasser and Sisi, or a picture of Nasser and Sadat, and then it stops with Mubarak. I mean, or sometimes they have all of them against the wall, so you can see how he identifies himself, or that he wants to please all his customers. So, yeah, of course, there is this image of Nasser who is still, I mean, I think the critical attitude toward Nasser, especially within the middle class, has grown. And there is also within a layer of the middle class and the elite a kind of nostalgia of the period before Nasser, with the kingdom, because then you had like, I mean, there are a lot of photographs and videos of the time before Nasser, and which represent like the streets of Cairo in a very rosy light, because everything was clean, and you had women in short skirts and things like that. So. But of course, for the majority of the population, it was a very bad period. And while workers, in my impression, they are less inclined to identify with the kingdom, but more with the period under Nasser, who, for them, is still a figure who did something for them. The role of anti-imperialism, yeah, like I said, I mean, it was. For the legitimacy of the regime, it was crucial because it was both an internal and external affair, of course. I mean, Egypt until 1956 was still occupied in part by British forces around the Suez Canal. So being anti-imperialist was defending national sovereignty. I mean, it was so it was an internal affair, and Nasser, as I mean, by getting rid of foreign influence in the Suez Canal, I mean, this was a huge asset for his legitimacy, of course. And on the other hand, because he was seen by a lot of nations who were themselves struggling to get rid of colonial and neo-colonial influences, and his success in the Suez crisis was then picked up by other nations, so Egypt was catapulted to the foreground of this whole movement of decolonization. And Egyptians, I mean, it was important for their dignity, and this was also something that returned in the revolution of 2011. It was not only a revolution for more democracy or for social justice, but also for dignity. And this was something that Egyptians felt they had under Nasser. So being important on world scale.
I didn't quite get that bit. So what was the dignity they were looking for in 2000?
Well, in 2011, one of the biggest issues was the random violence by police, by the Ministry of Interior, and the feeling that, I mean, in 1985 there was already this big divide between rich and poor. This increased only by the 2000s. And that on the one hand there were people in their gated communities with swimming pools who lived the life of pashas, and on the other hand there were people who had to live in cemeteries and the graves of the deceased. I mean, this huge gap between rich and poor was not only felt as a problem, I mean, as a material problem, but also as like, I mean, people are trampled upon. You know, they have no respect for common people of Egypt, the elite. So it's also a matter of dignity. Yeah. So both politically, morally, and economically, dignity.
Okay. Any other questions? Or? Okay. Yes.
Just a quick question, which you might not have an easy answer to, but we seem to be, hopefully not, but perhaps heading for some sort of horrible war between America and Israel on one side and Iran on the other side. Egypt nominally would be allied with the Saudi, the Western side in that conflict, but I mean there was a time in the past when the Egyptian soldiers were like sort of the biggest military force in the Middle East, not maybe Israel, but that hasn't been the case. I mean the wars have been in Iraq, the Gulf, decades and decades now. I mean, what military role do you think Egypt would have if there was some horrible?
If there was?
What military role would Egypt have if there was some horrible confrontation in the Middle East, some big war or something that's not an issue anymore?
At the moment, I mean, they would side with the US and the Gulf, I mean, against Iran. And this was different.
Support from the masses in Egypt.
It's difficult because when Morsi became president, he tried to relax relations with Iran, of course, to find a counterweight against Saudi Arabia. And this was then also in the propaganda used as, look, he is in favor of the Islamic regime of the Ayatollahs, etc., etc. So I think the start of any involvement of Egypt, I mean, there will be a huge propaganda war to convince that Iran is a danger, and there is already this propaganda going on. So, but if such a war continues, I think then the resistance really begins. But Iran is not an Arab country. I mean, during the first Gulf War, or maybe the second Gulf War of 1991, there was already a lot of protests in Egypt against the role or the support of Egypt for the invasion of Iraq, because it was an Arab country. And it's a bit sad, but Iran is seen as, you know, a different kind of thing. So, no, I fear for solidarity with Iran when the war should start, or immediate large-scale solidarity, as we've seen during the Iraq War or Palestinian Intifada. No. Also, it's so difficult now to organize something around political issues in Egypt today. This can change, of course, but it's
Okay, any other contributions? Okay, so traditionally, or usually rather, we go to the pub afterwards, and we're going to the Tavistock Hotel, which is in Russell Square,